The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Florence as walked through the Piazza della, his mind still clouded with the romantic notions that had sustained him through his youth. At 25, he carried himself with the earnest determination of one who believed that virtue alone could reshape the world, that noble intentions were sufficient armor against the machinations of lesser men. His father's words echoed in his memory. "A man must be good. Goodness is the foundation of all worthy endeavor." These principles had guided him through his education, his early career in the merchant guilds, and his tentative steps into the treacherous waters of Florentine politics. How foolish those convictions would soon appear, how childishly naive the belief that the world operated according to the moral principles espoused in philosophy texts and sermons. Had spent his formative years constructing an elaborate fantasy, a worldview built upon the assumption that others shared his commitment to honor, that agreements were sacred, that trust was the currency of civilized discourse. This boy within him, for that is what these beliefs represented, the residual innocence of youth, had yet to encounter the brutal education that awaited. The transformation began with a letter, delivered by a nervous page to modest quarters near the Arno. The parchment bore the seal of Medici's agent, a summons to participate in what was described as a commercial venture of mutual benefit. His heart quickened with excitement. Here was opportunity dressed in the language of partnership, a chance to prove that honest dealing could triumph in even the most complex negotiations. He had heard whispers of methods, but dismissed them as the jealous rumors of those who lacked the vision to appreciate true leadership. The meeting took place in a chamber beneath the Palazzo Medici, its walls lined with books and maps that spoke of power extending far beyond Florence's borders. 3 men awaited, his primary agent, Marco, a silk merchant from Venice, and whose business remained deliberately vague. They spoke of a trading venture to Constantinople, of silk routes and profit margins, of the substantial investment required, and the even more substantial returns promised. Listened with growing enthusiasm, calculating not merely the financial benefits, but the moral satisfaction of engaging in honest commerce that would benefit all participants. The initial investment, explained with practiced sincerity, must be substantial to demonstrate our commitment to our Ottoman partners, 50,000 florins from each participant to be held in trust until the first shipments arrive. The sum represented nearly everything possessed, his inheritance, his savings, the result of years of careful accumulation. Yet the mathematics seemed sound, the projections reasonable, the opportunity unprecedented. What followed was first encounter with the sophisticated machinery of deception. The documents appeared genuine, bearing impressive seals and elaborate signatures. The references checked out, supported by a network of accomplices whose stories interlocked with seamless precision. Most convincing of all was the apparent reluctance of his partners to accept his participation. "Perhaps," Marco suggested with feigned concern, "Young lacks the experience for such a venture. The risks, after all, are considerable." This reverse psychology, this appeal to his pride and determination, proved irresistible to a mind still governed by boyish dreams of proving himself among men of affairs. Committed his fortune without hesitation, driven by a combination of greed and vanity that he mistook for business acumen. The contracts were signed with ceremony, toasts were raised to future prosperity, and plans were made for the first expedition. For 3 weeks, lived in a state of elevated anticipation, already mentally spending his projected profits, already composing the letter that would inform his father of his triumph in the sophisticated world of international commerce. The revelation came not through dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet cruelty of absence. Failed to appear for a scheduled meeting. The offices that had bustled with activity stood empty, their former occupants vanished as completely as morning mist. The Ottoman Trading Company, when investigated, proved to be entirely fictional. The impressive documents were revealed as masterful forgeries. The references, when examined closely, led to addresses that existed only on paper, to businesses that had never conducted a single legitimate transaction. Found himself standing in the empty chamber where his dreams had been so carefully cultivated and harvested, the bitter taste of realization flooding his consciousness. He had been selected not despite his virtue, but because of it, targeted precisely for those qualities he had considered his greatest strengths. His honesty had made him predictable. His idealism had made him gullible. His faith in human goodness had made him the perfect victim for those who understood the mechanics of manipulation. The boy within him died in that moment of recognition, not through violence, but through the more profound trauma of absolute disillusionment. Every assumption about human nature, every belief in the ultimate triumph of virtue, every naive conviction about the fundamental goodness of civilized society crumbled beneath the weight of experienced truth. Stumbled from the chamber and into the streets of Florence, seeing his city with new eyes, recognizing for the first time the predatory calculations that governed every interaction, the careful deceptions that masked themselves as ordinary discourse. Days passed in a fog of recrimination and analysis. His methodical mind, freed from the constraints of wishful thinking, began to dissect the elaborate performance he had witnessed. He studied each element of the deception with the intensity of a scholar examining a classical text, identifying the precise mechanisms by which his emotions had been manipulated, his reasoning compromised, his defenses systematically dismantled. The sophistication of the operation impressed him despite his rage. These men had elevated fraud to an art form, had demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that surpassed anything he had encountered in legitimate business. As the initial shock subsided, found himself confronting a choice that would determine the entire trajectory of his future. He could retreat into bitterness, allowing his victimization to transform him into a cautious, suspicious creature who trusted no one and accomplished nothing. He could seek legal redress through Florence's courts, though his research quickly revealed that his adversaries had anticipated this possibility and positioned themselves beyond the reach of conventional justice. Or he could embrace the education he had received, studying his defeat until he understood not merely what had happened, but why it had been inevitable, given his previous understanding of the world. The third option appealed to something deeper than mere desire for revenge, though revenge certainly played its part. Recognized that he had been operating according to principles that were not merely ineffective, but actively dangerous in a world where others understood the rules he had ignored. His father's maxims about virtue and goodness were not wrong exactly, but they were incomplete, like navigational charts that showed only half the coastline. To survive and prosper, he would need to acquire the knowledge his opponents possessed, to understand the full spectrum of human motivation and behavior. This decision marked the beginning of true education, though it bore little resemblance to anything he had learned in the universities. He began to observe the city around him with new attention, studying the interactions between merchants and customers, between nobles and their retainers, between friends and lovers. Everywhere he looked, he now detected the subtle currents of manipulation and counter-manipulation that flowed beneath the surface of civilized discourse. A compliment was never simply a compliment, but a calculated attempt to lower defenses or extract information. A favor was never offered without expectation of return, though the nature of that return might remain hidden for months or years. The streets of Florence became his laboratory, its citizens unwitting subjects in his investigation of human nature. Watched how successful men carried themselves, noted the specific techniques they employed to gather information, to build alliances, to neutralize opposition. He studied the failures as carefully as the successes, identifying the moments when calculation gave way to emotion, when strategic thinking was compromised by personal desires or moral qualms. Most illuminating were his observations of Medici himself, whose public appearances now attended with the dedication of a disciple. Moved through crowds with the practiced ease of one who understood that every gesture carried political significance, that every conversation was an opportunity to gather intelligence or plant suggestion. Watched him deploy different personalities for different audiences, the concerned patriarch with the common citizens, the scholarly humanist with the intellectuals, the hard-nosed pragmatist with the bankers and merchants. Each persona was authentic in its way, yet none represented the complete man. Had learned to become what each situation required, to suppress those aspects of his character that might prove inconvenient or counterproductive. This compartmentalization of the self struck as the most crucial skill he had observed. The boy within him had insisted on presenting the same face to every situation, had taken pride in his consistency and transparency. This rigid honesty, he now understood, was a luxury that only the naive could afford. To operate effectively in a complex world, one needed to develop multiple selves, each calibrated to specific circumstances and objectives. The merchant required different qualities than the diplomat, the lover different skills than the adversary. A truly sophisticated man learned to access these different aspects of his personality at will, to become genuinely what the moment demanded. began practicing this multiplicity in small ways, modulating his behavior according to his companions and objectives. With his landlord, he presented himself as a responsible tenant facing temporary difficulties, emphasizing his family connections and future prospects. With potential business partners, he projected confidence and insider knowledge, dropping carefully researched names and demonstrating familiarity with current market conditions. With women, he learned to mirror their own desires and expectations, becoming whatever they needed him to be in order to lower their defenses and reveal their true motivations. These experiments in adaptive personality proved remarkably successful. Doors that had previously remained closed began to open. Information that had once been was freely shared. People began to trust him with secrets, to include him in their plans, to view him as an ally rather than a mere acquaintance. Discovered that most individuals desperately wanted to be understood and appreciated, and that providing this illusion of understanding required only careful attention to their words and behaviors, combined with the ability to reflect their own virtues and aspirations back to them. Yet even as he mastered these techniques, remained haunted by the memory of his former self, by the idealistic young man who had walked into that chamber beneath the Palazzo Medici with such confidence in human goodness. That boy's destruction had been necessary, he recognized, but the process had extracted a price that extended beyond mere financial loss. Found himself questioning not only the motives of others, but his own authentic desires and convictions. If he could become whatever each situation demanded, what remained of his original identity? If every emotion could be calculated for its strategic value, which feelings could he trust as genuine? These philosophical concerns seemed increasingly irrelevant as practical education continued. He secured a position as secretary to a minor Florentine official, using the role as a vantage point for observing the machinery of municipal governance. The work itself was mundane, copying correspondence, maintaining records, organizing meetings, but the access it provided proved invaluable. Learned to read the subtext that accompanied every official communication, to identify the hidden agendas that shaped seemingly routine decisions. His supervisor was a man of moderate ability elevated to his position through careful cultivation of the right relationships rather than any particular competence. Studied methods with fascination, noting how he managed to appear indispensable despite producing little of genuine value. The key lay in his ability to make others feel important, to present their ideas as if they were brilliant innovations while gently steering them toward conclusions that served his own interests. Never directly contradicted his superiors, but found ways to implement their instructions that enhanced his own position or advanced his personal agenda. Gained insight into the informal networks that truly governed Florence. The official hierarchy, with its impressive titles and ceremonial procedures, was merely a facade that concealed the real structure of power. Decisions were made in private meetings, in casual conversations, in the careful exchange of favors and obligations. The most influential men often held no formal positions at all, but operated through proxies and intermediaries, maintaining their power precisely because their involvement remained invisible to those who might challenge them. Began mapping these networks with the precision of a cartographer, identifying the key relationships and dependencies that shaped political outcomes. He learned to recognize the subtle signals by which information was transmitted, the particular phrases that indicated approval or disapproval, the specific gestures that conveyed instruction or warning. Most importantly, he discovered that this shadow government was not malevolent in any conventional sense. Its members were not conspirators plotting against the common good, but practical men seeking to advance their interests within the constraints of political reality. This revelation completed its transformation from idealistic youth to sophisticated operator. The boy within him had demanded that the world conform to his moral expectations, had raged against the gap between stated principles and actual behavior. The man he was becoming understood that this gap was not a corruption of some ideal system, but an inevitable feature of any complex society. Human beings were not perfectible creatures destined for moral evolution, but pragmatic animals capable of remarkable cooperation, when their interests aligned, and equally remarkable duplicity when they diverged. Part II, the crucible of calculated power. Armed with this new understanding, began to position himself for advancement within Florence's hidden hierarchy. His role as secretary provided the perfect cover for more ambitious activities. Who, after all, would suspect a mere clerk of harboring grand designs? This anonymity became his greatest asset, allowing him to move freely through the corridors of power while remaining below the threshold of serious attention from potential rivals. His first independent operation targeted the grain importation contracts that supplied Florence during the lean months before harvest. The existing arrangements, he discovered through careful research, were maintained through an intricate web of bribes, family connections, and mutual obligations that kept prices artificially high, while ensuring comfortable profits for a small circle of established merchants. The contracts themselves were renewed annually through what appeared to be competitive bidding, but was actually an elaborate performance designed to legitimate predetermined outcomes. Rather than attempting to disrupt this system through direct confrontation, an approach that would have guaranteed swift retaliation, chose to infiltrate it through strategic misdirection. He arranged to be introduced to Marco, one of the secondary players in the grain trade, presenting himself as the representative of a fictional Genoese merchant house with substantial capital and excellent connections in North Africa. The fiction was supported by carefully forged letters of credit and a network of accomplices who confirmed his story when inquiries were made. His proposal was elegantly simple. His supposed principals would provide financing for an expanded operation in exchange for a percentage of profits and preferential terms on future contracts. To make the offer irresistible, he structured the financing in such a way that would receive immediate benefits while the fictional Genoese partners assumed most of the risk. The mathematical projections were impressive, the documentation appeared authentic, and the references checked out perfectly. His greed overcome his caution, particularly when suggested that the arrangement be kept confidential to avoid alerting competitors to their advantage. Within weeks, had committed substantial resources to purchasing grain futures and expanding his storage facilities in anticipation of the promised Genoese backing. Maintained the illusion through regular correspondence and carefully staged meetings with supposed representatives of his principals, each designed to reinforce confidence while extracting more information about the grain trade's inner workings. The climax came when informed that his principals required a demonstration of good faith, a substantial payment held in escrow to guarantee commitment to the partnership. The sum demanded, 30,000 florins, represented most of his liquid assets, but the potential returns seemed to justify the risk. Had learned to read the signs of financial desperation, to recognize when a man's circumstances made him vulnerable to proposals that his rational mind would normally reject. Made the payment on a Thursday morning in October, transferring the funds to an account that had established under an assumed identity. By evening, had withdrawn the money and begun erasing the traces of his fictional persona. The Genoese merchant house dissolved into vapor, its representatives vanished, its letters of credit were revealed as masterful forgeries. Found himself not only robbed of his savings, but committed to contracts he could no longer fulfill, facing bankruptcy and possible criminal prosecution. Felt no guilt as he departed Florence for an extended journey to Venice, carrying his profits and leaving to face the consequences of his own greed and gullibility. The boy within him might have been horrified by such calculated cruelty, but that boy was dead, replaced by a man who understood that society was an arena where strength and cunning determined survival. Had been a predator in his own right, exploiting his advantages to extract excessive profits from Florence's citizens. Had simply demonstrated that in the hierarchy of predators, intelligence trumped established position. Venice provided the perfect environment for continued education in the arts of power and manipulation. The city's complex political structure, its intricate commercial relationships, its Byzantine social hierarchies offered endless opportunities for study and experimentation. Established himself as a broker of information, a role that required no substantial capital, but provided access to the most sensitive intelligence about trade routes, political developments, and personal scandals that shaped the city's dynamics. His method was deceptively simple. He provided genuine value to his clients while simultaneously gathering information that could be leveraged for future advantage. A merchant seeking intelligence about Ottoman tax policies would receive accurate, useful data in exchange for details about his own business relationships and financial situation. A noble woman concerned about her son's gambling debts would learn the precise extent of those obligations, while inadvertently revealing the family's political vulnerabilities and alliance structures. His network of informants grew organically as satisfied clients recommended his services to others. He cultivated clerks in government offices, servants in noble households, prostitutes who entertained wealthy merchants, priests who heard confessions, even children who overheard adult conversations and could be rewarded with small gifts for sharing interesting details. Each source provided a different perspective on Venice's hidden dynamics, creating a comprehensive picture of the forces that shaped events beneath the surface of official proceedings. The intelligence gathered proved valuable not only for its immediate commercial applications, but for its potential to influence future developments. By understanding the private motivations and vulnerabilities of key figures, he could predict their likely responses to various scenarios and position himself accordingly. When the Doge's nephew became involved in a scandal involving forged documents, had advance warning through his network of clerical informants. When a prominent banking family faced potential collapse due to bad investments in the spice trade, learned of their difficulties weeks before the information became public. These early warnings allowed to profit from events that appeared unpredictable to others. He shorted the banking family's ventures just before their collapse became evident, earning substantial returns while appearing to possess almost supernatural foresight. He positioned himself as an intermediary in the resolution of the Doge's nephew's scandal, earning gratitude and future access from multiple parties. Each success enhanced his reputation for reliability and discretion, attracting more lucrative opportunities and more sensitive information. Yet's most important education during his Venetian period concerned the psychology of power itself. He observed how successful men managed their relationships, noting the subtle techniques they employed to maintain loyalty while preventing any single ally from becoming too powerful. He studied the methods by which they gathered intelligence about potential threats, the ways they neutralized opposition without creating martyrs or inspiring vendetta. Most illuminating was his relationship with Cardinal, whose influence extended far beyond religious matters into the realms of politics and commerce. Had perfected the art of appearing to be whatever each observer needed him to be, a pious spiritual leader to the common people, a sophisticated intellectual to the humanists, a pragmatic dealmaker to the merchants. Spent months studying his techniques, attending his public audiences and private meetings whenever possible. The Cardinal's genius lay in his ability to make each person feel uniquely understood and valued while revealing nothing of his own authentic thoughts or feelings. He listened with extraordinary attention, asking precisely the right questions to encourage others to reveal their true motivations and concerns. He offered sympathy without commitment, advice without responsibility, encouragement without specific promises. People left his presence feeling heard and supported, often without realizing that they had gained nothing concrete from the encounter. Began incorporating these techniques into his own interactions, learning to project the illusion of deep empathy while maintaining emotional detachment. He practiced the Cardinal's method of reflective questioning, turning inquiries back on their sources in ways that elicited more information than they provided. He mastered the art of strategic silence, allowing others to fill conversational voids with revelations they had not intended to make. These psychological skills proved as valuable as his intelligence network in establishing his position within Venetian society. Found himself invited to increasingly important gatherings, consulted on matters of significance, treated as a trusted advisor by men whose own advisors were legendary for their cunning. He had learned to make himself indispensable not through any particular expertise, but through his ability to understand what others needed and provide it, without appearing to extract anything in return. The culmination of Venetian education came through his involvement in the negotiation of a trade treaty with the Ottoman Empire. Venice's commercial future depended on maintaining access to Constantinople's markets, but recent diplomatic tensions had created uncertainty about the renewal of existing agreements. The negotiations required delicate balancing of competing interests. Ottoman demands for military cooperation against their enemies, Venetian insistence on commercial autonomy, papal pressure for religious concessions. His role began modestly as a translator and cultural interpreter, his knowledge of Ottoman customs and languages having been carefully cultivated for precisely such opportunities. However, His understanding of the personal motivations and vulnerabilities of the negotiators, gathered through his intelligence network, quickly made him indispensable to all parties. He knew which Ottoman officials were susceptible to financial incentives, which Venetian negotiators harbored secret doubts about their instructions, which papal representatives could be influenced through appeals to their scholarly interests. Rather than simply providing information to his official employers, began orchestrating the negotiations themselves, subtly guiding all parties toward conclusions that served his own long-term interests. He arranged private meetings between key figures, ensuring that each encounter occurred under circumstances that maximized the likelihood of agreement. He planted suggestions that appeared to originate spontaneously, but actually reflected his careful analysis of optimal outcomes. The treaty that emerged from these negotiations was universally hailed as a diplomatic triumph, securing Venetian commercial interests while satisfying Ottoman security concerns and papal religious demands. His public role remained minor. He was credited only as a skilled interpreter who had facilitated communication. But the private gratitude of all parties established him as a figure of considerable influence. The Ottoman officials knew he had helped arrange the financial considerations that made their participation profitable. The Venetian negotiators understood that his insights had prevented costly miscalculations. The papal representatives appreciated his assistance in framing religious concessions in ways that appeared significant while changing nothing substantial. This success marked his emergence as a true power broker, a man whose value derived not from any official position, but from his unique ability to navigate complex relationships and produce beneficial outcomes for all parties. He had learned to transcend the simple dynamics of winners and losers, creating scenarios where everyone gained something valuable, while he positioned himself to benefit from all outcomes regardless of their specific nature. The boy within would have been horrified by the elaborate deceptions and calculated manipulations that had made this success possible. That idealistic youth had believed in the possibility of honest dealings, of transparent negotiations, of relationships based on trust and mutual respect. The man had become understood that such innocence was not merely ineffective, but dangerous in a world where others operated according to more sophisticated principles. Yet his transformation was not complete. The final stage of his education would require him to test these new capabilities against opponents who possessed similar understanding, to demonstrate that he had truly mastered the art of calculated power rather than simply succeeding against naive adversaries. This ultimate trial would come sooner than he anticipated, in circumstances that would challenge everything he had learned about human nature and the exercise of influence. Part III, the architecture of absolute influence. His return to Florence after 3 years in Venice coincided with a period of unprecedented political instability. Medici's death had created a power vacuum that multiple factions sought to fill, each convinced of their own legitimacy and superior claim to leadership. The family, despite their previous failed conspiracy, had rebuilt their influence through careful alliance building and strategic marriages. The faction, driven by religious fervor and popular support, demanded radical reform of both church and state. Foreign powers, France, Spain, the Papal States, maneuvered to install clients who would serve their broader strategic interests. This chaos presented with the perfect laboratory for testing his new capabilities against the most sophisticated operators of his age. The stakes were higher than any he had previously encountered, the potential rewards greater than anything he had imagined, the risks substantial enough to destroy not merely his fortune, but his life. The boy within him would have sought the safety of neutrality, hoping to avoid the dangers of political involvement through careful non-alignment. The man he had become recognized that periods of instability created opportunities for those bold enough to seize them and intelligent enough to exploit them effectively. His first strategic decision involved choosing which faction to support, though his actual choice was more complex than simple allegiance would suggest. Rather than committing himself exclusively to any single group, he developed relationships with all major players while maintaining the flexibility to shift his support as circumstances evolved. This required extraordinary sophistication in managing information flow, ensuring that each faction believed they possessed his loyalty while preventing any from discovering the extent of his involvement with their rivals. To the faction, presented himself as a natural ally whose experiences in Venice had convinced him of the dangers posed by excessive Medici influence. His intelligence about Ottoman commercial policies, gathered during his involvement in the trade treaty negotiations, provided valuable insights for their own business ventures. His apparent expertise in international finance made him a useful consultant on complex transactions. Most importantly, his previous victimization by Medici agents created a personal motivation for opposing their continued dominance that the found both credible and reassuring. With his followers, adopted a different persona entirely, emphasizing his moral revulsion at the corruption he had witnessed in Venice, and his growing conviction that only radical reform could save Florence from divine judgment. His detailed knowledge of Venetian decadence, of the sophisticated techniques by which wealthy men avoided their Christian obligations, provided compelling evidence for his broader critique of contemporary society. His apparent spiritual awakening, carefully calibrated to match the rhetoric and expectations of his audience, convinced them that divine providence had led him back to Florence at precisely the moment when his particular skills were most needed. The foreign agents presented yet another challenge, requiring to appear valuable without revealing the full extent of his capabilities or connections. To the French representatives, he offered commercial intelligence that could help them understand Florentine market dynamics. To the Spanish agents, he provided insights into Ottoman strategic thinking that might prove valuable in broader Mediterranean conflicts. To the papal officials, he presented himself as a moderate voice capable of mediating between extremist factions and preserving church interests through compromise rather than confrontation. Maintaining these multiple relationships required to develop an almost supernatural memory for the specific information he had shared with each group, the particular commitments he had made, the precise promises he had offered. He created elaborate mental maps of his various conversations, tracking not only what he had said, but how each statement might be interpreted and what implications it might have for his other relationships. A casual comment about Venetian military preparations, shared with French agents, might later contradict intelligence he had provided to Spanish representatives about Ottoman naval capabilities. The psychological strain of this compartmentalization was considerable, requiring to suppress not only his authentic reactions, but his natural human tendency toward consistency and transparency. He found himself becoming multiple people simultaneously, each with distinct memories, opinions, and loyalties. The merchant who discussed trade routes with the possessed different knowledge than the reformed sinner who prayed with his followers. The diplomatic consultant who advised foreign agents held different convictions than the patriotic Florentine who attended public meetings about city governance. Yet this multiplication of identity also provided with unprecedented insight into the true dynamics of the conflict consuming Florence. From his unique position at the intersection of all major factions, he could observe how their public positions related to their private motivations, how their stated principles aligned with their actual decision-making processes. Most importantly, he could identify the specific pressure points where small interventions might produce disproportionate effects on overall outcomes. His first major operation exploited tensions within the family itself, where younger members chafed under the cautious leadership of their elders. His nephew possessed both the ambition and the recklessness that recognized as exploitable weaknesses. Through carefully orchestrated encounters, began feeding information about supposed Medici weaknesses and opportunities for advancement that appeared to come from independent sources, but actually originated from his own intelligence network. The key insight provided concerned the Medici family's financial vulnerabilities, suggesting that their apparent wealth concealed dangerous overextension in foreign markets. This intelligence was accurate, had discovered the information through his Venetian contacts, but his presentation emphasized actionable opportunities rather than mere knowledge. Could position himself to benefit from Medici difficulties by shorting their ventures while simultaneously offering to purchase their assets at distressed prices. The strategy would require substantial initial investment, but promised enormous returns if executed properly. His response exceeded even optimistic expectations. Not only did he commit his own resources to the speculation against Medici interests, but he convinced other family members to participate in what he presented as a low-risk arbitrage opportunity. The family's collective investment in anti-Medici positions created a powerful incentive for them to take active steps to ensure those positions proved profitable. They began spreading rumors about Medici financial difficulties, pressuring their own clients to withdraw funds from Medici banks, even sabotaging specific Medici commercial ventures through their extensive network of business relationships. Simultaneously, was providing equally valuable assistance to faction, though in very different form. His supposed spiritual awakening had made him a trusted advisor on practical matters that the friar's other followers were too unworldly to understand. Helped them organize their public demonstrations for maximum emotional impact, selecting locations and timing that would amplify their message while minimizing the risk of violent confrontation with opposing groups. He advised them on communication strategies that would appeal to Florence's emerging middle class without alienating potential aristocratic supporters. Most importantly, provided followers with intelligence about the private lives of prominent citizens, information that could be deployed strategically to support their campaign for moral reform. His network of informants had uncovered evidence of adultery, financial fraud, religious hypocrisy, and personal vice among many of Florence's leading families. Rather than encouraging indiscriminate revelation of these secrets, counseled selective disclosure designed to maximize psychological impact while preserving the possibility for redemption and reconciliation. The cumulative effect of these simultaneous operations was to accelerate the destabilization of Florence's existing power structure, while positioning to benefit regardless of which faction ultimately prevailed. The family's financial attacks on Medici interests created genuine vulnerability in what had previously appeared to be an unassailable position. Its moral crusade undermined the social consensus that had supported the old order while offering an alternative vision that appealed to popular frustration with economic inequality and political corruption. Its most sophisticated manipulation involved the foreign powers whose intervention could determine Florence's ultimate fate. Rather than simply providing intelligence to all sides, he began orchestrating a complex deception designed to convince each power that their rivals were closer to achieving their objectives than was actually the case. To French agents, he provided evidence, carefully fabricated but entirely credible, that Spanish influence was growing rapidly among key Florentine families. To Spanish representatives, he offered equally convincing proof that French gold was corrupting important officials and threatening to tip the balance decisively toward French interests. These deceptions had the desired effect of spurring increased foreign intervention, with each power escalating their investment in Florentine politics to prevent their rivals from achieving decisive advantage. The resulting influx of foreign money and attention created new opportunities to extract resources from all parties while advancing his own position. French agents paid substantial sums for intelligence about Spanish activities that fabricated from his knowledge of their general methods and objectives. Spanish representatives rewarded him equally well for information about French operations that was accurate in its details, but carefully selected to create misleading impressions about their overall significance. The papal agents presented the greatest challenge because their intelligence capabilities exceeded those of the secular powers, and their understanding of activities was correspondingly more sophisticated. However, turned this advantage against them by feeding them accurate information about his relationships with other factions, while carefully concealing the extent to which he was manipulating rather than simply observing developments. To papal representatives, he presented himself as a valuable asset who had successfully penetrated multiple opposition groups, but remained fundamentally loyal to church interests. This relationship with papal agents provided with his most important intelligence, advanced knowledge of Pope Alexander VI's decision to support's removal from power through a combination of ecclesiastical pressure and political intervention. The information came through Cardinal, whose own network of informants had learned of the papal decision weeks before it would be implemented. Immediately recognized the implications of this intelligence and began positioning himself to benefit from its inevitable downfall. Rather than simply abandoning his relationship with faction, chose to orchestrate their destruction in ways that would maximize his own advantage while appearing to result from natural political processes. He began providing them with advice that seemed strategically sound, but actually increased their vulnerability to papal pressure. He encouraged them to adopt more radical positions that would alienate moderate supporters while providing ammunition for their opponents. Most subtly, He helped them plan public demonstrations that would create the appearance of growing strength, while actually exposing their leadership to arrest and prosecution. The climax of manipulation came when he arranged for himself to receive fabricated intelligence, suggesting that the Pope was prepared to negotiate a compromise that would preserve his position in exchange for moderating his reform agenda. This information, delivered through intermediaries who believed it to be authentic, convinced to adopt a more conciliatory public stance, just as papal agents were preparing to move against him. The resulting appearance of weakness and uncertainty undermined support among his most committed followers, while providing his enemies with the perfect opportunity to strike. When was arrested, tried, and executed, had already positioned himself as a moderate voice who had attempted to prevent the crisis through reasonable compromise. His efforts to mediate between the friar and his opponents were remembered favorably by all parties, despite having been designed to ensure exactly the outcome that occurred. His apparent prescience about the Of's position enhanced his reputation for political wisdom and strategic thinking. The collapse of faction left the family and various foreign-backed groups as the primary contenders for power, but their positions had been fatally weakened by earlier manipulations. They had committed so many resources to their anti-Medici speculation that they lacked the liquidity necessary to capitalize on their rivals' difficulties. The foreign powers had become so suspicious of each other's activities that their interventions canceled each other out rather than producing decisive advantage for any single faction. Into this vacuum stepped himself, not as an obvious candidate for leadership, but as the indispensable mediator whose unique position and demonstrated competence made him essential for any successful coalition. His relationships with all major factions, his understanding of their true motivations and capabilities, his proven ability to navigate complex negotiations, made him the natural choice to broker the agreements that would determine Florence's future government. The settlement that emerged from these negotiations appeared to represent a triumph of moderation and compromise, establishing a new governing council that included representatives from all major factions while avoiding the dominance of any single group. His official role remained modest. He was appointed to a technical position as coordinator of commercial relations, but his actual influence extended far beyond his formal authority. The new government's major decisions required his input, because only he possessed the detailed knowledge of factional relationships and individual motivations necessary to predict the consequences of various policy choices. Had achieved something remarkable, the transformation of Florence's political structure in ways that served his own interests while appearing to benefit all participants. The family maintained their commercial privileges while accepting political constraints that prevented them from challenging the new order. Former supporters found opportunities to participate in government while abandoning their most radical demands. Foreign powers maintained their access to Florentine markets while accepting limitations on their political influence. Yet's greatest achievement was not political but personal. The complete destruction of the boy within himself, who had once believed in the possibility of governing society through moral principles and honest cooperation. That naive youth had been replaced by a man who understood that power derived from the systematic manipulation of human weakness. That influence flowed from the careful orchestration of others' desires and fears. That lasting success required the ability to transcend simple categories of good and evil in favor of more sophisticated calculations about cause and effect. The boy had demanded that the world conform to his expectations about justice and virtue. The man had become shaped the world to serve his own purposes while convincing others that their own interests were being served. He had learned to make himself indispensable not through moral authority, but through practical utility, not through inspiring others to noble action, but through understanding and exploiting their fundamental motivations. Standing in the Palazzo Della on the evening when Florence's new government was formally installed, reflected on the magnitude of his transformation. 3 years earlier, he had been a victim whose naivety made him easy prey for sophisticated predators. Now he had become the apex predator himself, capable of manipulating entire political systems while remaining invisible to those he controlled. He had destroyed the boy within and allowed the man to rise, just as had counseled centuries later. Power belonged to those who understood its true nature and were willing to embrace its requirements without the comforting illusions that weakened lesser men. The education was complete. The transformation was absolute. Had become exactly what his enemies had always been. A master of human nature who understood that in the struggle for survival and dominance, moral considerations were luxuries that only the defeated could afford to maintain.